So welcome to the video series hosted by the Critical Policy Study Network. The discussion today will be led by Jennifer Dodd. She will present her thoughts on critical framing analysis. As I already mentioned, we're gonna post the content that we discussed today in the platform of the Critical Policy Study Networks, which currently have roughly 240 subscribers, 23 video clips, and over 5,300 views. We also have Tamara and Philippe as the discussion for today, and Frank, the coordinator of this network, will moderate the session. So I now hand over the introduction to you, Frank.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jennifer Dodd. I've known her for a long time, actually since she defended her dissertation. Jennifer is an associate professor of public administration and policy at Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, and affiliated with the faculty in the Women's Studies, Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at the university. Her research focuses on the interpretation of policy conflict, primarily in the environmental field, but in others as well. She's been a co-editor of the Critical Policy Studies Journal and played an important role in its development during those years. She's won several prizes, including the Sam Overman Best Paper Award from the Complexity and Network Studies section of the American Society of Public Administration, and from the American Political Science Association, both the Paul Volcker Junior Scholar Research Grant Award and the Haywood Alker Best Paper Award. This is only a partial list of her accomplishments and achievements. One can go to her homepage at the university and read much more about her impressive engagements and activities. So with that fairly brief introduction, let me welcome Jennifer and turn it over to her. Jennifer.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Frank. And thank you both to Frank and Piyapong for organizing this and all of your efforts to organize the Critical Policy Studies Network. And I also thank Tamara and Philippe for being here today. I know you'll bring some really interesting commentary and discussion to the day. So in this talk, I want to address what I see as a really important question for scholars who do framing analysis, which is, can framing analysis be critical in the sense of foregrounding issues of justice on the one hand, but also systems of domination and oppression on the other? And if so, in what ways can that be done? I think framing analysis has been criticized in the past, mostly because of its roots in phenomenology, which in a nutshell focuses on understanding experience directly without judgment to understand the ways that people make sense of their worlds from their own perspective. And so from this point of view, it can lack a critical edge in the sense of exposing domination and oppression. As Katrin Braun has observed, framing analysis is not inherently critical, but depends on how, to which end, and within which framework frames are being employed. So I want to draw out what I see as implicit critical moves in a lot of framing analysis, but also develop some explicit critical analytical moves that intentionally foreground issues of justice or freedom from domination and oppression. So I think taking this more critical move is really important today, given our contemporary policy making, the way policy making is occurring now, and broader shifts that are occurring in society, economically, socially, environmentally, and politically. For example, the rise of authoritarianism, the climate crisis, the possibility of future pandemics, rising economic inequality, shrinking of the public sphere under neoliberalism, and so on. So I argue, in order to fully apprehend the situation in the midst of these transformations, framing scholars need more explicit critical analytical tools. One, to reveal the deep concerns of citizens, organized groups, and others involved in policy conflicts, and two, to move toward a more explicit analysis and critique of power. So let me say a little bit more about framing before I go into these critical framing moves, just to lay the foundation for people who might be listening. So framing is an approach to interpretive policy analysis, which is primarily concerned with the centrality of meaning in human life. A focus on meaning orients scholars to the ways that people construct an understanding of their worlds in interaction with social groups, who come to understand ambiguous events and actions and so on in the world as fitting into this category and not that category. So the concepts and categories that people use to make sense of their world are seen as reflecting their particular point of view. So to understand and explain human action, we need to first understand how people make sense of their worlds, as this serves as the basis for their actions. Furthermore, social reality is multifold, because interpretation is shaped by one's experience, and experiences are lived in the context of intersubjective meaning-making, that is, meaning-making within a community. Different people situated in policy contexts will develop meaningful categories that are different from their counterparts, maybe even in the same policy setting. So framing analysis is this type of interpretive policy analysis. It orients scholars to the importance of meaning in shaping policy processes. So specifically about framing, I see framing as a process, both as a way of representing the world to others, but also as a way of apprehending the world and understanding the world. As Rain and Schoen famously described it in the 1990s, it's a way of selecting, organizing, interpreting, and making sense of a complex reality to provide guideposts for knowing, analyzing, persuading, and acting. So I want to focus on what Tamara and I have defined in an earlier paper in 2024 that explains 4 different approaches to framing. I'm going to draw on what we called the contestation approach, which also draws on social movement theories to understand framing as strategic. It's an intentional activity meant to influence public policy. So, for example, if someone frames abortion as a woman's right to bodily autonomy, they're strategically representing abortion as an individual right related to a group-based identity, in this case, gender, which downplays alternative interpretations of abortion, such as viewing it through the lens of religious doctrine. This person promoting abortion as a right may do so to convince people to support pro-abortion legislation to guarantee women's rights. And this frame may also enable this person to apprehend an opponent's actions as an attempt to impose religious doctrine or as a threat to women's rights. So in addition to this idea of framing as strategic, there are several other important elements to this contestation view, which is that policy actors will intentionally include or exclude certain elements of framing based on their perception of the relevance for actually taking action in policy. So they might integrate different ideas, images, symbols, arguments, and so on as relevant to what they're trying to do. So again, in the abortion example, someone who's advocating for pro-abortion legislation might cite scientific studies that show that when we ban abortion, women face all kinds of negative health and economic consequences. And they might use certain images, such as women being barred from entering and harassed while they're trying to enter abortion clinics, to show that their rights are being violated. And of course, on the other side, groups might use very sort of graphic images of aborted fetuses to raise fear and concern about the treatment of the unborn. And of course, people might connect these to issues of anger and fear and other emotions. So there's this selection that happens in terms of what elements will be used. There's a lot of agency for people to select how they frame issues to try to bring about certain policy effects. And then finally, groups compete to frame policy issues, to set the agenda, and to formulate public policy in a way that favors their own perspective. Framing and counter-framing moves are especially important to understand framing contests, as actors not only affirmatively assert their own point of view through framing, but also downplay the framing moves of their interlocutors or opponents. So, for example, in a debate around fracking in New York, pro-fracking activists framed fracking as an economic opportunity, while environmental activists framed it as an environmental threat. But as the debate evolved, as the contestation evolved, those who wanted to ban fracking also started talking about the economic consequences that would occur if fracking were allowed, negative economic consequences in terms of shutting down organic farming, for example, or harming organic farming and small businesses. So once a policy actor can successfully set the terms of debate in a particular frame, they gain substantial interpretive resources. If they can convince policy actors, for example, to see smoking as a public health issue rather than an individual problem, the public health solutions seem more reasonable than individual ones. And so this comes with a lot of interpretive power to shape policy moving forward. So now I want to move to talking about the difference between what I see as implicit ways of doing critical framing moves in the contestation approach to framing, and also more explicit critical framing moves. I'm not going to talk about all of the ones that were in the paper. That's the foundation of this talk, but I want to highlight certain ones to kind of raise my point that we really need to think more about how we can bring in critical moves into framing analysis to address the kinds of issues we see in the world today. So some approaches to framing analysis are implicitly critical. That is, they depend on policy actors themselves raising issues of justice or oppression in the context of policy conflicts, rather than using critical theoretical concepts to unearth issues of justice that may or may not be part of the explicit part of the debate. So, for example, in my own research on fracking, analysis focused on surfacing injustice framing by an anti-fracking environmental justice coalition. This coalition framed a proposal to allow fracking only in impoverished communities who needed economic development as deeply unjust. So they saw this as an unjust policy proposal because their only option for economic development would be a very environmentally harmful one, rather than offering them other alternatives. So in the broader arc of the conflict, this coalition kept centering issues of justice in the discussion, and that came out in the analysis. In this type of implicitly critical framing analysis, the analyst's task is making explicit what Rain and Schoen call the assumptional basis of competing frames. This approach exposes deep disagreements and major points of contestation across groups and their significance, and comparison is really critical to this type of analysis. So to give another example, my colleague Diana Trujillo and I, she's from the University of Los Andes in Colombia in South America, we compared the different ways that groups were framing an oil extraction project in a very environmentally sensitive area in Colombia. In this conflict, citizens and organized groups framed the government's policy to sanction oil and gas development as linked to a long history of state violence and neglect. And so they were bringing in this temporal notion in their framing to talk about time in framing. And they linked this proposal to a long history of state violence and neglect and connected that to a civil war and their fears that this type of violence would be perpetuated into the future if this oil and gas development project were to continue. In contrast, oil and gas companies and the government framed this issue in very narrow time frame, focusing on the immediate environmental impacts of oil and gas development and the immediate actions that could be used to mitigate those impacts to protect the environment, ignoring these deep concerns of citizens. And so this kind of implicitly critical framing analysis can sort of surface the ways that different groups frame issues and the stakes that are involved in that type of framing. So it clearly represents policy issues and politically relevant questions, but it's perhaps the most implicitly critical move, foregrounding notions of justice and freedom from oppression only in ways that participants in these conflicts are raising those issues themselves. So I argue a more explicit attention to critical framing moves and analysis can better address contemporary transformations that raise fundamental questions about power. These more critical framing moves don't depend on policy actors' own framing of justice or oppression, but directly bring critical theoretical concepts to understand framing contests and their significance. To put into context the assumptional basis of framing that's being raised in policy disputes more explicitly, but to look at the deeper significance of those, and to also generate insights about systemic or structural forms of power. What are these power disputes fundamentally about? So in the paper, I mention 3 explicit critical theoretical moves, and I'm going to focus on the first one, which is using explicitly critical theoretical concepts in framing analysis. If there's interest, I can talk about the other 2, which is talking about the political, social, and economic context and its influence on actors' capacity to engage in framing disputes. So this is looking at more institutional forms of power. And the last one is to blend framing analysis with specific critical theoretical perspectives like discourse analysis or feminist analysis. But again, I'm going to focus on this idea of bringing critical theoretical concepts into framing analysis because I think it's an especially vivid example for understanding our contemporary challenges. So I want to bring an example of an analysis that a team of my students conducted looking at framing disputes surrounding state-level policy in the United States in Utah in 2023. There was legislation proposed to ban gender-affirming healthcare for transgender individuals, such as blocking hormone therapy, surgery, or puberty blockers for people who are transitioning from one gender to another. And my students made what I call a double critical move. So first, they used from framing analysis George Lakoff's idea of Orwellian language, which involves framing unpopular views in more palatable but misleading language, so the real purpose behind communication is hidden. So in this case, in Utah, the people advocating for a bill banning gender-affirming healthcare framed their goals as protecting young people. So they explicitly were saying we're protecting young people by banning these healthcare practices. While their unstated goal, according to my students' analysis, was actually to reinforce an unpopular notion of a binary notion of gender, where we only have men and women and nothing in between. So the students revealed this Orwellian language, first by pointing out that those who supported the bill relied on this safe healthcare frame to mask their unpopular views that transgender youth are deviant, and by exposing a contradiction. Their bill banned so-called harmful gender-affirming treatments only for people who violated gender norms, but not for people who affirmed them. So, for example, it would still be permissible for biological women to receive breast enlargements, where it would not be possible for a transgender person to receive such care. Second, their second analytical move, in addition to this Orwellian language, was they related this framing, this Orwellian framing, which hides the real intention behind framing, to what Iris Marion Young calls cultural imperialism. So this is bringing in a critical concept from critical political theory. And so cultural imperialism is when society uses dominant meanings, or when society's dominant meanings, such as binary gender, render a group invisible while marking it out as other. So in this case, the Orwellian framing masking transgender as deviant was used to actually try to make transgender people invisible and mark them out as other. So there's an assertion of a cultural imperialism of gender binary norms. And so these 2 critical moves were necessary to understand the significance of the situation. If they hadn't used these frames, they might be stuck in a debate around what kind of healthcare is safe for young people, rather than really understanding this deeper significance of the debate. And so I want to argue that this double critical move is especially important today. There are several other states in the United States, for example, that have passed or are trying to pass similar bills against gender-affirming healthcare to make trans individuals invisible. But there are also other efforts to create oppressions under the guise of protecting individuals. So, for example, there are efforts to restrict voting rights for Black Americans under the guise of protecting democracy, or to restrict abortion rights to presumably protect women's health, but again, to sort of reinforce conservative religious ideas in public policy. So framing analysts can use this double critical move to really understand these debates and to also expose these forms of oppression that are being attempted in these policy debates. So just to wrap up, my intention has been to make these critical moves more explicit, and moreover, to offer a set of analytical tools that can be applied to understand contemporary policymaking. This critical orientation to framing analysis is really important given our present critical moment. This context of multiple transformations in our economy, our politics, our society itself lends itself to realignments of power. Framing analysis that remains on the surface of specific policy conflicts may miss more fundamental struggles for and over power. And so I think these moves have considerable potential to unmask oppressive forces in framing disputes. This dual move of using Orwellian language combined with critical concepts, I think, is especially relevant for exposing systems of domination and oppression and ways that we might resist those. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for a very insightful, clear, and useful presentation. We have two commentators, Tamara Metze and Philippe Zittoun. Let's take Tamara first. Tamara.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Piyapong. Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me also to discuss this interesting chapter, and also with your clear presentation and the call for and the urgency. You explain why it's such an urgent chapter. What I really like is that it's further developing this contestation approach, and is pushing people doing framing analysis and thinking about, okay, how can we use this to even better reveal what biases are hidden, or where oppression is being proposed in hidden language. As you also nicely explained just now, also the role of the visual you briefly mentioned, which is of course interesting, but it also puzzles me. So maybe to really kickstart this discussion, and it's something we've been thinking about quite for a long time. So if it's at all possible to be freed from domination and oppression, no? And of course, I'm then thinking of Foucauldian type of work in which we will always be disciplined. So there seems to be some kind of hope in these dual moves and these critical moves that it will also help us be freed from domination and oppression. So I was wondering if you can give that some thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, I think even Foucault would acknowledge that there is always openings in discourses for critique, for social change. And I come from a perspective of studying groups that attempt to make social change, and I do have faith that that is possible. I think we're in a moment right now where, we're seeing such major transformations and, moving in a very conservative and authoritarian direction here in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. So I think we might not be able to fully escape, forms of domination and oppression, but we can certainly make them better, right? And I think there are forms of domination and oppression that are worse than others. Like if I'm a person right now who is being dominated and oppressed, I'm also pretty free, right? And I think we can look for freedom for people who might be much more constrained given the ways that we're organizing our societies. And I think, we need to look at both the ways that we're creating the world through our language and expose, these hidden meanings, and also look at action and what actions can sort of further different ideas that would bring more freedom. I don't know if it can ever be a total project where we're totally free, but I think there can be more there can be more freedom, and we can ward off the kinds of oppressive forces that are operating now. So where people's voices are being, people's voices are being oppressed, but also people are being bodily removed, from the United States right now, and bodily harmed in other places where there's conflict going on in the world. So I think, we need to focus on those things to see how language is complicit in creating worlds that are oppressive. Yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. It's hard to answer that one on the spot, but I will give it some more thought.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because you touched upon it,
Yes.
but I just want to sort of see where we move forward. So if you think about the language being used by people oppressing others, it's actually also the language of trying to blame others for oppressing them and limiting their space. If you think about the manosphere, of course, that's the example to go to, but also, well, with transgenders, maybe it's not mentioned that explicitly, but in the manosphere, it's of course claimed that feminists limit the male freedom, no? So the language of oppression and freedom is actually also incorporated in, of course, those who have more power. So how to cope with that in a linguistic or in a framing analysis, no? So the words are not enough in that sense, maybe.
Before you answer that, why don't we bring Philippe in?
Philippe,
and we then can collect some questions. Philippe? Philippe?
Okay.
Can you his mic? Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. So I must prepare a few comments and questions in the same way. So thanks, Jennifer, for your text and your chapters. It was very interesting and part of this what we discussed since a long time. So your text have three parts, and I want to comment, discuss, question, and criticize each of them. So the first part is about the concept of framing that you use and as a key of understanding, as a direct key of understanding. So I would like to push you to discuss the concept itself. I mean that, okay, it's about meaning, but we know that we have a lot of concept to understand meaning. And the concept of framing coming originally from Goffman was not, and you precise in your text, the way you take it. And in Goffman, one of the main ideas about social convention, what is a constraining, the way of understanding. So if you have, for example, a fighting, the frame is a fighting in the street or in the box match. And what tried to explain Goffman is how the frame is a social convention behind the discussion. But when you use framing, I'm not sure that there is a real difference between framing and defining. So, and it's about discourse. So, and it's something important. So when you give different example in your text about, I don't know, shale gas, because it's a topic we share, it's not something like something behind the actor, or it's not an implicit thing. It's clearly an explicit thing. Is how people define if shale gas is an opportunity, economical opportunity, or if it is an environmental issue. And I'm not sure that the concept of framing by itself is the one who clarify the relationship between what you observe and what you try to speak about. And with this idea of coming from what is social convention to something which is more about implicit, explicit, but what you speak a lot is about explicit. So this is why I was a little confused. And my main question about this first part is, are you sure that we don't have to discuss more about the concept itself of framing? and now to better understand what you call framing of analysis, if we have to rethinking about discussing, defining, arguing, all these concepts, and with behind this concept, the relation with the people who speak, because the last point about the framing, what is little a difficulty for me is that sometimes the concept of framing, which is something that imagine behind the discourse, is also behind the actors itself, behind the speaker, and the speaker disappears, and it's a problem. As Foucault said, behind the discourse, maybe there is nothing. It's the discourse itself. So there is a real debate. And I think that in the first part, I would like to push you to discuss the concept, because if I take just framing and take another one, I think you say the same thing. So, but I think there is different nuance and different things. About the second part is a critical part. And the last part is a critical of the critical. So about the second part, it's more about power. And I think it's also, for me, a question about why you separate the question of critique of power and the question of the analysis itself. Is there really two levels? I mean that, in my view, the critical way, which consists to say, okay, if someone say, I do this for justice, but when I do this for justice, in reality, come back to the Tamara's question, it's domination. You try to reveal something in the system dimension, in the systemic dimension, and so finally, the fact to separate the critical dimension from the framing, for me, ask a question about how you brought the two things. But I think that you use this for the third part. And this is, I arrive to the first part and the question, which is not far away about what evoked Tamara question. Okay. It's about the critique of the critique. What is difficult is two things, in my view. The first is when you want to be critic of the critique. For example, you give the example of opposition between domination and justice. You suppose by using the concept of justice is the question of power have disappeared. So, as we mentioned, as Frank mentioned a long time ago, when you use, coming from Habermas, when you use the concept of objectivity, it's a power argument also. So when you use the concept of justice, it's also a concept of power. And this is why I say it's near what said Tamara, how you can imagine that you forget the question, and it's a risk to go to the critique of critique. It's suddenly to go in the arena, what you say, but when you go to the arena, suddenly you have the risk to forget the question of power. And this is, for me, the main question, if the third part don't kill the second part, was separate from the first part. So this is why it's all in the same way. So to conclude, and for me, it's like the debate between Boltanski and Bourdieu, you know, between what Bourdieu said, the critical sociology, which is to reveal what is the world and how we can denounce the power, domination, blah, 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 and it's the role of sociologists. And Boltanski would say, yes, but by critical, do we have to take into account the part of the critical in the process, and how the critique of domination is also a kind of domination and counter-domination, and it's part of the thing. So if you don't, if you separate the world, you miss, you put the sociologist or the political scientist or the researcher like in a dominant position, like outside the process. He can see the world without the power, but in reality, he has the power. I just want to conclude about this. Thanks for the text. It's very stimulating, but and it's very engaged a debate about the critical of the critical.
So those are difficult questions. Do you want to, Jennifer, speak to that before we bring Tamara back in? Might be better.
Yeah, so I knew Philippe was going to ask me these very difficult theoretical questions. I also want to get back to the question that Tamara sort of left open too. So let me just go back So Tamara asked me this question about using language to oppress and how do we actually understand using concepts of freedom and justice as a way of oppressing, right? Because I think, what did you say, manosphere was this sort of language of freeing, men being free, men are oppressed, so on and so forth. So I think actually the Orwellian, looking for Orwellian language is really useful. And I do believe that you can expose the ways in which language of justice and freedom is actually being used to be oppressive by looking for Orwellian language, which is I'm assuming, I don't know so much about the details of the use of manosphere framing, but I suspect that tied up within that language are also ways in which masculinity and these, maybe hyper masculine ideas are also very connected with this idea of manosphere, I would imagine. And so you can take a look at that and understand that this idea of the manosphere, this sort of notion of oppression and the need to free men, is tied up within an intent to create a world that is hyper masculine and has a gender hierarchy where men are on the top. So, but I think that that depends on using framing analysis in a way that's really focused on context. So understanding the places in which this language is being articulated. So thinking about, the context in which words are being spoken, the settings and so on, but also the ways that language itself is contextualized within other language. And so how are these ideas of needing to free men and create freedom for men tied up within ideas of gender hierarchy where men are predominant? I would imagine that that's in there. And then, of course, you can also look at actions and how the actions and maybe proposals or ways in which this group might actually trying to create certain kinds of worlds through their action might also reveal some contradictions in the idea of freedom. So I think that's why Orwellian language is especially powerful and useful. And then in this case, I would want to bring in some concepts from feminist analysis that might be helpful in terms of revealing these sort of hidden dimensions of language. Okay, so getting back to some of Philippe's questions, so the first question was, how do we understand framing? And I'm not using framing in the way Goffman intended it. So when you look at people engaging in some kind of altercation physically, where they're maybe hitting each other and pushing each other, is that fight or is that play? And that's, Goffman's understanding of framing as the context within which we act and understand ambiguous actions as one thing and not another, right? So I understand that, but it's not what I'm talking about here. I still think there's an underlying assumptional basis that we can unpack when we look at the statements that people make and the arguments that people make in terms of what is the broader system of meaning that is underneath or connected to specific kinds of utterances. So for example, when someone in the shale gas debate calls environmentalists wacko and crazy and, just trying to impose imperial order on everyone so that businesses can't function, but we're being forced to, limit economic activity or whatever. That utterance is connected to a broader system of thought that we can begin to construct. There's a structure there of language that we can start to construct by looking over statements and so on. Lots of statements to sort of piece this together. But then also within the contestation with debates among people, there's a certain assumption that can be underlying that is not explicit also. So for example, when I was looking at the fracking debate, in the beginning, there was an assumption that fracking was inevitable and that it was something that was going to happen. No one said that explicitly, but the conversation was, how do we bring in the equipment, the labor, how do we pass the certain sort of minor technical policies that we need to do to allow fracking on an enormous scale in New York? And that was an assumption for many months that people were making, that this is inevitable, this is going to happen, so how do we prepare for it? But people weren't saying it's inevitable. It was just the context within which people were operating and functioning at the time. And then activists started saying, wait a minute, we should really think carefully about whether or not we should do this or not. And then the conversation shifted to a very different kind of underlying assumption, which is this is something we should think carefully about before we do it. And that changed the debate totally. And then the debate kind of exploded, and some of the actions that were taking place ceased because the assumption was very different. This was no longer something that was inevitable. So I still think that we can look for this dimension of framing without having to think about it in Goffman's terms. So I think with your other two questions, I'm not sure I'm seeing things in such a binary way that you've laid it out. And I'm not fully sure I understand your second point about making a difference between implicit framing and sort of thinking implicitly about framing in a critical perspective and separating that from issues of power. I actually see those as very connected. And I think even when I was talking about the ways that framing analysis is implicitly critical, it still deals with notions of power, absolutely, and is raising what I described as very politically relevant kinds of questions that you can still understand and get at from that more implicitly critical theoretical perspective. So yes, power is still very much a part of language, even in this implicit critical perspective. And I don't mean to draw a sharp distinction between critical and power, if that's what if I'm understanding your question. But I still think that we need to move toward a more explicit critical orientation as analysts in order to understand some of the things that are happening today. Because, for example, bringing in this idea of Orwellian language connected to critical theoretical concepts, because they're going to allow us to really understand better what's going on in those debates, rather than just relying on what people are describing themselves as a critical problem within these contexts. And of course, that leads into your third question, which is, can we separate ourselves from the debate? And I realize that that's a very complicated question epistemologically, right? And in terms of how we see ourselves as connected to certain debates. And so what I would say to that is, if I'm a critical scholar who's looking at a policy conflict from the perspective of critical theory, I am part of the debate, even if I'm seeing it at some distance, right? I'm not someone who is out there advocating for pro-abortion legislation, although I could also sort of blur the lines between scholarship and activism. But I am trying to look at these debates somewhat dispassionately, even though I understand that I'm limited in how much I can do that, because I am part of the world, right? And I have also taken a stance as a critical scholar, so someone who looks for systems of oppression and domination in policy conflicts, and so might be more aligned with those who share, maybe more left-leaning oriented political commitments. So I am part of the discussion as a policy scholar, and I don't see myself as being able to actually have an objective stance, but I can try to see things with some analytical distance, even as I see myself as part of the discussion. So I hope that I hope I'm understanding your critiques there. I do think these are important issues, and part of what we need to be discussing. Actually, I end the chapter by saying, if we take a critical stance in trying to understand policy, we are risking our own credibility as scholars and researchers. But the times seem to also demand that we start to blur those lines between scholarship and activism because of what we see happening with sort of an increase in oppressive forces occurring in society. But those are very complicated questions, and we have to, I think, struggle with the balance between taking those political risks and still having academic credibility.
Tamara, did you want to raise another question? You want to come back in?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I had, of course, a couple of more questions prepared, and I think they can nicely tie into this discussion. So maybe also to further push you a little bit on the thinking on what can the role of us as researchers be. I think that the question can also be, so who's making these critical moves, no? So at some point in the chapter I'm reading, I'm thinking, oh, it's really about us as researchers doing a framing analysis, making these critical moves in how we analyze. But then at other points, empirically, I think I see you also describe how others make these critical moves. So I think that nicely ties into this question that Philippe also was, that you also ended with, like, how much am I part of the research? How possible is it for me as a researcher to be detached? And I also want to push your thinking on the role of critical theory, because I think, yes, the theoretical notions coming from gender studies and elsewhere, post-colonial thinking and so on, will help us find biases in our thinking. At the same time, I'm also thinking, are we not missing out on, for example, also, and maybe bringing back in particular knowledges that are also out there? For example, in the whole transgender debate, or the non-existence of transgender as the political agenda is currently, of course, from biology, we know that it's not so black and white. So how come as critical scholars, particularly in interpretive tradition, we seem to have forgotten that this type of knowledge that can be part of framings is also quite important, maybe to unreveal or to reveal what you call the Orwellian language. No, so I think these two also go hand in hand. But is there not also a promising avenue ahead in that, with that respect?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think these questions are all getting around the sort of boundaries between politics and analysis, right? So I don't draw a sharp, when we talk about what is the role of the researcher and who's making critical moves, I think researchers can do that. Obviously, political actors do that all the time. I think people who are pushing for social change, whether it's progressive social change or more regressive social change that seeks to go back to some imagined idealistic past, can bring in critical ideas to inform debates. So I don't see a sharp distinction between what scholars can do and what activists can do. And often they're involved in conversing with each other. I think we develop critical concepts based on what we see, policy actors discussing, and policy actors will often draw on critical theoretical perspectives to take action in the world to create change. So I don't think we need a sharp distinction between, researchers and activists in terms of bringing a critical lens to understand policy issues. I think it's a big conversation that spans those boundaries. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to move on to another point, Frank. So if you want to jump in, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. We have to be a little bit attentive to the time, but we still have time.
Okay, great. So the other question you had, Tamara, is the role of critical theory, which you say can help us identify our own biases by pointing out things that we might not be attending to. And I think you're absolutely right about also looking at other knowledge bases. I was thinking myself as I was preparing for the talk today that there is science out there that shows that we don't have two genders in the world. There's a whole spectrum and a whole range. People are born as hermaphrodites, for example. And there's a whole complex relationship between our biological expression of gender and what our hormones are doing. So I think we can, use those as resources to try to understand. But I think, that is helping us try to grasp the quote unquote real reality of gender, when the sort of biological facts of gender are things that are also constructed through certain systems of knowledge. And then we have, ways of understanding and thinking about things that maybe come from religious community, which is sort of its own, knowledge system of a way of understanding the world. And those things can be very much in contradiction with each other, or they can also be blended to try to understand things. And of course, this is where conflict comes from, where groups are bringing ideas from different forms of science, or pseudoscience, right, to sort of affirm beliefs that might not actually be based in scientific knowledge, but might contradict that. I think this is why we are having, a pretty intense post-truth moment, because a lot of scientific research is very problematic if you're trying to create a certain world that is based in religious doctrine, for example, or more conservative ideas. Case after case after case, we see a conflict between progressive ideas that are rooted in sort of scientific knowledge against conservative ideas that are based more in sort of ideological perspectives that contradict what we see from science. So I think, and Frank's work really speaks to this idea. We have to look at the ways that people are using these different kinds of knowledge in policy debates to see what's happening there and how people are trying to use different forms of knowledge to create certain effects in the world. But yeah, I think that's all part of sort of framing and bringing together different aspects of framing to make a case in policy conflicts.
Philippe, do you want to ask a final question? Philippe?
Yes. Okay. So I just want to react to your answer because I think it's a long debate about the 3 points very quickly to clarify some point. About the first one, I totally understand that you don't use the Goffman way, but the way you use framing is what is the difference between defining, and it's something very important, and arguing. The second point is about what I comment to criticize is the fact to separate the framing from the power question in your text. For example, the argue about power is one of the framing way of the political debate and disagreement. Let's take an example. Actually, there is a big debate between in US, because US is very excessive in so many ways. So one of the arguments is how the famous contestation gender to contest the power of people who have taken. But what is happened with Trump is to say that they have taken the power at the university and go back. So it's part of the argument and about what I call more the narrative of the argument. So just to say that it's inside the framing, and this is why I don't separate. And last point, very quickly, you use about the third point, I'm not totally convinced by your argument in the sense that you say, oh, but we are all part of the world, but it's not enough to say that to answer to the question. I just want to say that when you go on the critique of the critique, you suddenly depoliticize the concept of justice in the sense that suddenly the concept of justice is the one who can be judged without a dimension of empowerment. About power. So people who use I work for the justice is also used as a power argument. This is what I say. And this is why there is a thing to say we are all in the society, but at the moment the researchers say, oh, but there is a way to see justice without as a good argument against domination. It's not the same point of view. You change the perspective. It's not because you are only, you be part of the one who say, oh, I don't speak about power in this case. You know what I mean? Which is an illusion. And this illusion is also a powerful argument. I stop here. So it's just to relaunch the debate.
Okay. Jennifer, you want a quick response? I mean, these are actually complicated questions that we're not going to resolve today. And they will continue to keep us busy. But having said that, do you want to make a final comment?
Yeah, I'll say that I totally agree that when policy actors are raising issues of justice, they are absolutely trying to establish a certain order of power. I completely agree with that. And so our job is to understand what are they doing when they're raising questions of justice and what are they trying to create and establish. And we can also be critical of that, I think, in the way that Tamara was asking us to do, which is that when some people raise questions of justice, they're actually not trying to bring about justice, but they're actually trying to reinforce systems of oppression. And so we have to look at that and see what's happening there when people use concepts of justice. I think even people who are using justice from a progressive perspective can also be creating systems of oppression for some groups, right? By, I think there's been a conversation in poverty studies, for example, that, when we try to change the perceptions of people who are poor and create a more valorized notion of poor people, we can also be creating oppression for people who can't meet those standards, right? People whose lives are completely a mess. They become invisible. They become even, we might create a policy that creates more oppression for people who might have mental health issues, who don't conform to expectations in society. So I agree that power is definitely a part of framing issues in terms of freedom from domination. I don't mean to say that's an absence of power, right? It's so much tied up with questions of power. I think we could again debate on your other point, but maybe I will leave that there since we only have a couple of minutes left to see if there are any other points to raise.
Well, I think we're out of time.
Okay.
I think this will be an important contribution to our video series on critical policy studies. I would point out that a version of this talk can be read in the forthcoming volume, Interpretive Policy Analysis, edited by myself, Doug Torgerson, and Sibylle Munch. And actually, one could come and hear it again in Chiang Mai at my course, right?
Yes.
So let me thank all of the participants for your time and interesting questions. And we will be continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for these very thought-provoking comments. I really appreciate it.
Yes,
Yeah.
they were. Okay.